It's November 28th and I'm in a field of winter canola in Niagara County, and as you can see, we've had a lot of growth. It was very warm and sunny through October. Even in early November we had highs of 20 degrees in this area, and in the last couple of weeks we've had lows of 0 and highs of say 9 or 13, so not yet below 0, but just a few days with temperatures above 5 where the canola might still be growing, although as we've had less sunlight there's probably less growth happening. This field was planted the last couple days of August, so not too early for this area. Typically I'd recommend between September 1st and 5th. Certainly a lot of growers in Ontario are pushing a little bit earlier and earlier, and so early planting and great weather are reasons why we've had so much growth. You can see in this field we have some really nice root systems, so nice big roots, but also quite a bit of top growth. And so I've never really seen this much growth in the fall in winter canola in Ontario. We have some examples of a little bit smaller root systems in this field, although I feel a little bit silly saying they're small because I've certainly seen much smaller roots on plants that survived relatively harsh winters in Ontario. So we don't see any plants bolting in this field, which is great. We've really put Mercedes to the test. We know it has a vernalization requirement, but we've planted it early and let it get huge, and we're not seeing any bolting. There are some fields where I've seen a few plants that are flowering, but when I look up closely at them, they don't have a lot of foliage, and to me they look more like volunteer canola plants. So that indicates to me that there are probably some off-type seed in the bag and not really anything to worry about, and hopefully aren't an indication that the whole field is about to bolt. So why do these plants get so big? One thing we'll see with high populations is plant-to-plant competition. And so the plants, as they start to shade each other, just try to grow taller and taller to avoid shade or capture sunlight over top of their neighbors. And so that's why we start to see these giant leaves like this. Now this field, the population is good. They probably seeded around 250,000 seeds to the acre, which is what we recommend. But it is on 7.5-inch rows. And so when the plants come out of the ground, they're very small, they're not shading each other, but on those narrow rows, as they get bigger, they see more shading, and I think that's why they've been encouraged to grow very tall. I think that nitrogen also has something to do with it. So we typically recommend some N in the fall, maybe 30-40 pounds of N to the acre to encourage growth and have big healthy plants heading into the winter. But we didn't anticipate all this great weather, and I think plants have really gotten away from us. And in this field, we have some sludge applied to the field as well. And so historically, that's worked well for this grower in getting that growth ahead of the winter, but I think that is part of why there are such huge plants. And there are areas of the field that didn't receive sludge, and they look a little bit more like this. So they're not quite as large and tall, and they're much more flat, and they have bigger root systems, so that, difference in kind of the root to shoot ratio where there isn't sludge in this field. But this plant is also from the edge of the field where the population is also a little thinner. So what will happen here? Will we have good overwintering success? I've never really seen plants like this in the fall, and I do have a couple of concerns. So this plant, the crown is here, and the growing point is a few inches higher. So it is a raised growing point, even though it hasn't bolted. And that's just because of that competition, and the extra growth has caused the plant to get bigger, and it has that raised growing point. And that leaves that growing point a little more exposed. It's not tucked down into the whorl of the plant close to the soil surface like it is in a plant like this. And so it is at a little bit higher risk of winter injury. But one thing I think that's working in our favor is, like I've said over the last couple of weeks, temperatures have started to decline, and we haven't had a sudden cold snap. And so I think that'll help the plant sort of harden off. Because if you have a big succulent plant like this and all of a sudden it gets very cold, I think that is where we would likely see more winter injury. The other thing we can expect in the spring is a lot of these plants will probably lose a lot of their foliage. It just kind of rots off through the winter. The plants can't really maintain these big leaves through winter. Historically, that hasn't been a concern in Ontario, or we haven't seen any issues with that. As long as we have these big, healthy roots, they tend to do fine and regrow early in the spring, and we don't see any yield loss as far as we can tell. We'll want to be sure that we carefully check the health of those plants by cutting plants open in the spring and checking that the tissue inside is white or green and not rotten and necrotic. With those leaves rotting off through the winter, we might have a bit of a smell in the field, a bit of a cabbagey smell because of that rotting tissue. If you get out of your vehicle and it's in a really overwhelming, powerful cabbage smell, then you know that you need to do a really careful job of checking roots, because when we have that really strong smell, it usually means that the roots are rotten and we don't have as good a winter survival as we'd like. One thing that concerns me with these raised growing points is when we come in to apply our nitrogen and sulfur in the spring, we're likely going to cause some damage. So whether the crop is bolted or just has these raised growing points, when we drive over it, we're probably going to cause some damage. And so normally we would recommend a wide floater tire, but in a case like this, we might want to try a narrow tire so we're running over fewer plants, because we are going to cause damage when we drive through this field. When we have nice flat plants like this, I much prefer that, before it bolts, get that end on so the nitrogen's on when the plant needs it, but also we're not really causing damage when we drive over that plant. So I really look forward to coming back in the spring and working with growers to evaluate plant health, and I have my fingers crossed for high yields in 2025.